I would proceed this way. I would give you, each of you, 30 minutes, and after every talk, I would open for questions, and let's see, a quarter of hour, 20 minutes. My problem is that at 7 p.m. I have to fly home, so I think we will be able to finish. I would be happy if we could finish before. Anyway, non so chi, vedo magari anche inutile che io traduca il mio già pessimo inglese, vediamo quanti siamo, un attimo solo. Vabbè, comunque procediamo in questo modo. Ogni oratore ha una mezz'ora e poi alla fine raccogliamo delle domande alla fine di ogni intervento e procediamo uno dopo l'altro senza sosta. Natascia, per prima cosa presento la prima oratrice, and so Nastassja Pugliese is assistant professor at the Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, and she worked on Spinoza, for instance, his Latin sources, his theory of imagination, and Conway's monism and theory of individuation. So we'll listen to her, and she will speak us about imagining God and experiencing transformations on the reception of Spinoza in 17th century England. So the last thing is I asked every non-speaker to switch the camera off and the microphone, of course, too. So, Natascia.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Francesco, for putting this together. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I want to say first that this is a work in progress. I did not have the chance to tie it all together as I wanted. So these are actually extracts from my annotations and not exactly a fluid text. So I'm sorry for the mess. I'm also, under jet lag, so let's see how it goes. So my talk today, it's on Spinoza's reception. So I'm building first on the work of Rosalie Coley and Sarah Houghton. And it's interesting that, whereas as Coley from a 1963 paper says, Spinoza was a sort of an intellectual hero and a cultural symbol in 19th century England, studied and respected by Coleridge and George Eliot, who actually wrote the first translation to the English language of the Ethics. On the 17th century, his reputation was completely another one. Still marked by the discussions of the 16th century Reformation and the English Civil Wars, Spinoza was immediately interpreted as a true atheist who, because he had been excommunicated, was actually a communicant of no church. So reception studies are informative of the complexities of textual interpretation, and it kind of shows how the impact of ideas change according to audiences, to the historical times, and interest of readers. For if the German intellectuals of the 19th century, like Novalis, deemed Spinoza as a God-intoxicated man, believing as Heine that only malice of lack of judgment could describe Spinoza's teachings as atheistic, for like no one has ever expressed himself more sublimely about God, about divinity as Spinoza. In the mid of 17th century in England, Spinoza was classified as godless man, a godless man, and a heretic. So no two descriptions could be further from each other. And to understand the particularities of the readings of 17th century English philosophers, it's important to delve into the research on the material history that underlies the philosophical context of the reception of Spinoza in England. After I show my hypothesis on a sort of way to analyze the primary sources that depends on considering Conway's reply to Spinoza, I will reconstruct core arguments to show how monism was interpreted as atheism and how the interplay between imagination and reason was read as a claim of enthusiasm and mysticism. So, reception of Spinoza in 17th century England, and I'm sorry I don't have a PowerPoint or a handout or anything like that, so bear with me. So for Colley, in this 1963 paper, Spinoza's reception was marked by an England armed against atheism. Spinoza was understood as an extreme hobbyist who contributed to the secularization of thought, forcing institutionalized religion criticism and strengthening metaphysical reflection as a foundation for theological discussions. The first Englishmen to read Spinoza were those theologians deeply involved in the intellectual crisis of the 17th century, the Platonists of Cambridge. According to Colley, Spinoza's reception in England is centered around the publication of the TTP and follows the following sequence of events. So the TTP is published in 1670, and then in 1671, Philippus van Limburg, a Dutch remonstrant, a member of the Protestant movement that split the Dutch Reformed Church in the 17th century. So Philippus van Limburg sent the TTP to Oliver Doyle and to Henry Jenks in Cambridge. These two did not write refutations to Spinoza, but other Cambridge men did, such as Henry Moore and Ralph Cudworth. The main topics of discussions were the critique of revealed religion and the authenticity of the scripture, as well as the nature of God and Christ. But Sarah Houghton, in a 1984 paper, I think these are the two seminal papers on Spinoza's reception in England. So Sarah Houghton later reminds us that Spinoza was known in England before the publication of the TTP in 1670. From his correspondence with Henry Oldenburg, who was actually a German, but arrived in London in the 1650s and stayed there as a diplomat and a member of the Royal Society, according to this correspondence that starts in 1661, Spinoza is describing his reasons to writing the TTP. So actually the reception begins before the publication of the TTP, and is also discussing charges against him of atheism while defending liberty to philosophizing. So building on Colley and Houghton and analyzing Conway's critique of Spinoza, adding her as a piece in the puzzle of the reception, together with the date she composed, the Principles of the Most Ancient and Modern Philosophy, which was actually published in 1690, but written a few years before she died in 79. It is very likely, and this is sort of my historiographical hypothesis to interpret Conway's criticism of Spinoza, that the TTP was not the only source of Spinoza's philosophy for the Cambridge Platonists, and of course to Conway. So though the Ethics was only published posthumously in 1677, it was written between 61 and 75, and many of its parts were shared through the Spinoza-Oldenburg correspondence. This issue sort of appears because Corde and Course, on their introduction to Conway's Principles, they consider that when she herself claims to be rejecting Spinozism, she's actually engaging against the accusation of atheism and is not specifically refuting Spinoza's philosophy. Cordet and Course go along with Pierre Bayle in his Historical and Critical Dictionary when explaining that most of the time, authors of the 17th century who were saying they were refuting Spinoza were not actually discussing his philosophy, but just offering general criticisms against atheism. So I think that to construct, and Conway actually says that her philosophy is an attempt to fix the wrongs of Spinoza's philosophy. So it's also the way that we look at how she engages with Spinoza and Spinozism sort of defines the way that we interpret her principles as well. So this is very important. So I think that to construct a picture of the kind of Spinoza, or the share of Spinoza's philosophy the Cambridge Platonists were engaging with in the early days of the publication of the TTP, and the sort of Spinoza that was available to them, we should definitely consider Spinoza's correspondence as a source of reconstruction of those available theses. For example, it is through the correspondences that Pierre-François Moreau reconstructs the dates of composition of the Ethics and the TTP, figuring out which thesis had been composed when. And it is also through this reconstruction that Itzhak Melamed can argue for the TTP as a laboratory of Spinoza's metaphysical thesis. It is in the letter 6 to Oldenburg that Spinoza states, and I quote, "I do not separate God from nature, as everyone known to me has done." Also, in the first letters written to Oldenburg in 61, Spinoza refers to two works he had already completed, the short treatise and the treatise on the emendation of the intellect, and states that he's writing a longer and more complete work in which he exposes the whole of his philosophy. Spinoza calls this work "my philosophy" in square quotes, because that's how he calls. In another moment of his correspondence with Oldenburg, Spinoza tells him that there is a group of friends organized around Simon de Vries discussing the fragments of his "my philosophy." Spinoza's reference to "my philosophy" is usually interpreted as being a reference to an early manuscript of the Ethics. In a letter to Baumeister in 65, Spinoza says he's already composing the third part of the Ethics and had written until proposition 80. In the letter to Bleenborg, also around 65, where by then Spinoza starts calling this manuscript Ethics. It is around 65 that Spinoza was writing propositions 36 to 37 of part 4. According to Moreau's reconstruction of the dates of composition of the Ethics in Spinoza et le Spinozisme, it is at that moment that Spinoza stops writing the Ethics and starts composing the Tractatus. The TTP is written in the course of 5 years, from 65 to 70. Until 65, there is a first version of the Ethics manuscript, which Moreau calls Ethica A, divided in at least 3 parts and named "My Philosophy." Spinoza finishes this manuscript around 75 and goes to Amsterdam to try to publish it, but gives up from fear of reception. This is present on letters 62 and 68 of Spinoza's correspondence. The final version, or the Ethica B, is published only in the Opera Postuma. These dates show that even before the Tractatus, a version of the manuscript of the Ethics was already circulating in the intellectual community of the 17th century. Even if we consider the circulation to have been restricted to the circle of Spinoza's friends, including Lodewijk Meyer, we can see that he used to rewrite and summarize some sets of propositions of the Ethics in his letters. For this reason, parts of the manuscript or summaries of the content of the early version of the Ethics then circulated much more widely. It is very likely that intellectuals from the Cambridge circle, including Conway, had access, if not to the whole manuscript of the Ethics, to parts or summaries written by Spinoza himself throughout his correspondence. Itzhak Melamed in 2010 chapter argues that an analysis of the TTP can also tell us about the development of Spinoza's metaphysical doctrines, especially the identity of God's essence and existence, the notions of substance and attributes, as well as the identity between God and nature. Although there is nowhere in the Tractatus where Spinoza asserts the identity of God and nature, Melamed shows that there are 2 passages which strongly suggest this identity. This is in chapter 4, on the claim that the more we know natural things, the greater and more perfect is the knowledge of God, which is a claim that also appears in the definition 16, proposition 1, part 1 of the Ethics. In chapters 13 and 14, where Spinoza argues that God's essence is his existence, and that God, according to his essence, is everywhere. These theses alone allows for the claims of atheism and enthusiasm that are central to Henry Moore and Conway, and the Neoplatonists in general. So when we look to the same context of reception, not by trying to find what actually Conway knew or studied or how she actually engaged with his philosophy, but if we look to the same context of reception through Henry Moore, who was actually Conway's tutor, who was in Cambridge while Conway was not, because she was a woman and couldn't study in Cambridge. So if we look to the same context through Henry Moore, who died in 1687, some 10 years after the publication of the Opera Postuma, the situation actually is more clear. So Henry Moore wrote two anti-Spinozist works, the Demonstration duarum propositionum, it's a very long title, the Demonstration, and the Epistola Altera. Both were published in his Opera Omnia in 79. The Epistola Altera was written in 77, so 7 years after the TTP, and published in 79, same year of 77, the same year of the publication of Spinoza's Opera Postuma. So the Epistola Altera was the first book-length refutation of Spinoza, right? It contained a reconstruction of the thesis of the TTP, and in the Scholia, we can find notes on Spinoza's Opera Postuma. So it's very interesting because this book, not only Henry Moore's Epistola Altera, but also Conway's Principle, they were the first refutations of Spinoza written in the English language. The Epistola Altera as the first book-length refutation, and Conway's refutation was a smaller criticism, but they count as the first writings in English against Spinoza or engaging with Spinoza. And the whole problem of the material reconstruction of the reception comes into place because since they are the first, they had been published right after, sort of almost at the same time that the Opera Postuma was being published. So historians ask themselves what actually they were engaging with, right? Given the small time frame that they had to study those books and receive them and write their refutations. So in the Epistola Altera, we find Moore's own refutation of Spinoza, but more specifically how in chapters 13 and 15 of the TTP, Spinoza is sort of destroying the foundations of faith. But in the Epistola Altera, not only Moore refutes Spinoza, but he also offers his defense of God as a transcendent moral agent. And we know this about Moore because on a letter to Robert Doyle, he describes how he found the authorship of the TTP, and I'll read it to you. He says, this is Henry Moore. I came across the posthumous work of Benedictus de Spinoza when I was in London. The main reason why I bought them was that I wanted to make sure that once I had perused it to a sufficient degree, I could establish with greater clarity, both for myself and others, that I had not done Spinoza any injustice, either in attributing to him the aforementioned treatise, or in interpreting any of its places with undue harshness. And as regards to the first point, it is absolutely clear on the preface of said works that Spinoza is the author of the theological political treatise. For the author of the preface states openly that the principles of Cartesian philosophy demonstrated in geometrical order, 1 and 2, containing metaphysical thoughts as appendix, and the TTP were written by the same author, namely the same to whom he also describes those works which were given to the learned world under the title of posthumous work, etc., etc. So Moore had access to the posthumous works. He had access to the TTP by the time it was published anonymously, but he also cites in the same letter a letter to Oldenburg. So since he had access to the posthumous works, he had access to Spinoza's correspondence. So he says in a letter to Oldenburg, he says, I entertain an opinion on God and nature far different on that which modern Christians are wont to uphold, for I maintain that God is the immanent cause of all things, not the transitive cause, etc. So this is where I stopped the reconstruction part, right? So the point is that the Cambridge Platonists had access to the ethics, to parts of the ethics, to summaries of the ethics while it was being written. So before 1677. And they all had access to the TTP as well in the 70s. What is important is that they knew well the thesis regarding Spinoza's conception of God, Deus sive natura, and Spinoza's conception of the epistemological framework that is at stake on prophets when they supposedly prophesize, and the epistemological framework of regular common people, right? Which are the same for Spinoza. Because these two theses allow for the claims that appear among the Cambridge Platonists that are actually the claims to which they engage the most, which are monism as atheism and enthusiasm as a certain relationship between imagination and reason. Enthusiasm is a kind of relationship to the knowledge of God. So now monism as atheism. Do I have some time? I think I have 15 more minutes or so.
Yes.
Okay.
At least 10 minutes, but up to 20, it's fine.
Okay. I'll try to go a little bit slower. So Henry Moore was writing against the background of the Reformation and looking to find the principles of an ethical Christian life. So along with other Cambridge Platonists, he considered that philosophy and theology were well matched and reason could help on matters of faith. According to Weimer in a 2008 paper, on the book called An Explanation of the Grand Mystery of Godliness, Moore conceived of two kinds of atheism, the Aristotelian and the Epicurean. On the Aristotelian, all miracles and abstract entities like apparitions and ghosts are the effect of the imagination. On the Epicurean, he pointed out the denial of incorporeal principles on the explanations of nature, such as that operated by defenders of mechanicism. So the denial of incorporeal principles on the explanations of nature would have impious implications. Moore was on a quest against atheism, but also against the false religion of enthusiasts. In the Enthusiasmus Triumphatus, Moore criticizes famous historical figures who considered themselves to be inspired by God and led to sectarianism, shunning away from true religion. Although Moore locates Spinoza's TTP on the atheism of the second kind, the Epicurean, he was also considered as a true atheist, meaning that he could fit both descriptions and even the accusation of enthusiasm. So Moore's fiercest critique was due to his defense of spiritualism. Moore did not accept the notion of an immanent God and of an identification between God and nature, for otherwise, God could be explained by mechanical laws, just as nature could in principle be. Moore, however, is also critical of mechanicism. He does not think that nature can be explained in mere causal terms. And now I cite more. I must admit that it has always seemed to me to be quite a miracle indeed that matter, though in itself stupid and devoid of all life, should on its own bosom pour forth substantial form, or living substances endowed with sense, imagination, memory, and great wit and sagacity. Or that, although it is not essentially life, but some entirely inert, stupid, and merely passive subsistence, it should immediately on itself steer such operations as I have just mentioned, without any impulse or without. It's you know, a very confusing 17th century English 17th century English text. So actually, on these passages that I have here, that it would be better if I had shown you, what Moore is saying is that substantial forms, material things, cannot be endowed with sense, imagination, memory, wit, or sagacity. And if we think that they are inert matter, they could not at the same time act and move in general. So for Moore, matter cannot be inert. It cannot be endowed with imagination and movement without the postulation of some kind of spiritual substance. So he arrives at this bottom line where we sort of must assume the existence of spirit everywhere and of a superior spirit commanding the multitude of countless natural atoms of matter. So after criticizing mechanicism and the inertness of matter, he argues in defense of a providential God, which is actually an infinite spirit that is immaterial, has causal powers, and acts by means of his own intelligence. The thing is that Moore's spiritualism entails not only that God is immaterial, but that there are spirits in each and every natural object explaining their movements. So it's like, for Moore, if you believe in God, you also have to believe in other immaterial spirits and acting in matter. So Moore believes in witchcraft, right? And in all sorts of spirits that exist independently from matter, saints, for example. And he defended as well the existence of miracles, of course. And criticizes Spinoza that denies that miracles exist, right? So Moore thinks that reason should investigate spirits as such, right? Not as part of nature, but spirits as spirits. And this should include the study of demonology and the workings of witchcraft. Poor superstition, Spinoza would say, right? So this is more against Spinoza's monism as atheism, right? Because since Moore considered that Spinoza was a hobbyist as well, so he by identifying God and nature, this would take out of this description of reality spirit as part of the mechanism, right? As part of the explanation of reality. So in this sense, monism is atheism. And again, if one is supposed to believe in a transcendent God, one is supposed to believe in all sorts of transcendent spirits, right? And then Conway's Conway's critique, she wants to show against Spinoza that God is not constituted by the creatures and that the creatures are not part of God. Her main disagreement is the identification that Spinoza makes between God and nature, making one being of both, right? And then Conway conceives God as, in a true and real sense, an essence or substance distinct from his creatures, although not divided or separate from them, but present in everything most closely and intimately in the highest degree. But at the same time that she does not want to accept what Spinoza considers to be a corollary of his monism, that is, that creatures are somehow parts of or inhering God, right? So she does not want to accept that creatures inhering God, right? And this is a corollary of Spinoza's monism, because he says that whatever is in God, and nothing can be nor be conceived without God. And that's proposition 15 of Ethics 1. So from these theses of Spinoza, it follows that God is an immanent cause, like in proposition 18, given that everything that there is in God. Conway's critique is directed towards the notion of God's immanence and its consequences, so the absence of divine providence, free will, and teleology. And then on her turn, she conceives of a monism, where God acts as a transitive cause and cannot be completely identified with creatures and Christ, nor be considered as a fully separate substance. And this for her is sort of a paradox, because in her system, God is distinguishable from Christ and creatures to the point that God becomes sort of a substance of its own, on its own. But God is only able to act as a transitive cause because God and the substance, the finite substance, share some characteristics. So it's paradoxical in the sense that it is the shared qualities between the substances or the creatures and God that allows for Conway to explain causation between God, Christ, and creatures. So this is them, Moore and Conway, against Spinoza's monism. And now the second major criticism against Spinoza of these two Cambridge Platonists that are actually in very different spectrums of the group. So the second major criticism was that of enthusiasm, right? Enthusiasm as understood by them as the false capacity of knowing and speaking truly about God's understanding and will. Sorry, I got interrupted here. So enthusiasm as an interplay between imagination and reason. For Moore, as we have seen, God is transcendent to the world, and as a moral agent committed to univocal goodness, God is able to reveal himself to prophets and to intervene in natural and human affairs. The prophets would have then a sort of a boniform faculty, acting as an internal sense that before language or discursive reasoning is able to grasp the universal goodness of God. This is the soul's innate epistemic power of knowing God and his designs. But to be activated, this boniform faculty, it depends on God acting upon the prophet as he sees fit. And this is important, as God sees fit. There are various ways according to which God acts, so providence and God's care may or may not happen, being sort of independent from man's rational grasp of it, as well as from obedience to God. The boniform faculty for Moore is the measure of all subsequent cognition. So the cognition of the prophet is like the standard, the most important is the measure of all subsequent cognition. It is a faculty situated between God and soul. It is the form of the good acting on the soul and moving the soul. It approves of reasoning and helps practical reasoning since it acts as sort of reason approving itself. The boniform faculty acts to restore everything to the state of happiness intended by God, and it functions as a faculty able to grasp the original vision of God. I'm almost done. Men are not prophets, so their epistemic workings are different. Weimer argues that Moore has a Neoplatonic view of imagination and reason, and that imagination sort of plays the role of this intermediary between the material and the immaterial world, but not as perfectly as this boniform faculty of the prophets. So a longer research is needed in my part to fully display Moore's own view of the interplay between imagination and reason. But the important thing is that Moore distinguishes between the cognition of the prophets and the workings of God to actually allow for the prophets to have visions of the good. And for common man, we have imagination and reason, and the common man are sort of incapable of grasping the good as perfectly as the prophets. And this is, again, a critique. This is part of Moore's critique of enthusiasm, what he sees as Spinoza's defense of enthusiasm, right? And I'll explain why in a second, and I'm about to finish. So for Conway, it is the relationship between God and creatures. The relationship between God and creatures is explained as one of emanation, right? So the motion between the bodies are mediated by some kind of sympathy and antipathy that occurs among them. So sympathy functions as a medium of both union and transmission of movement between parts. So images will have their effect depending on how sympathy and antipathy mediates the relationship between the spirits involved. Since every transference of vital actions for Conway implies in a mutual change, the subjects gain more vitality, or they can lose vitality depending on how, with whom, or with what they interact with. So the cognitive activity for Conway is sort of a two-way. And cognition for Conway implies in transformation, right? So cognition is always transformative for Conway. So the faculty for Conway that sort of mediates between reason and cognition is imagination, right? So for Conway, since cognition is always transformative, we can have good cognitions that are going to increase our vitality and make us imagine ourselves as better beings. And actually we are able to become better beings due to this imaginative capacity. But at the same time, we can do some bad imagining. And this explains sin, and this also explains how that human beings can become beast-like, right? So this is how the sort of interplay between imagination and reason occurs in Conway. We can imagine our transformation, our own transformation for the better, and we can imagine our own transformation for the worse, and we will become this thing that we imagine. So and this argument on how an individual can change its own movement and its mode of being completely without changing its own substance, right? Conway considers this argument that she's offering as a way to fix Spinoza, because she sees that if Spinoza is arguing that there is only one substance and everything is sort of part of this substance, one could change into other beings without a problem. For Spinoza, that won't happen, because for Spinoza, you have a limit of change. You can only change so far without losing your own constitution, individual constitution. So Conway extrapolates on Spinoza's view. So her refutation of Spinoza is not actually a critique of enthusiasm, but she's extracting sort of the ultimate consequences of monism. And just to finish, like where in this is Spinoza, and I just want to reconstruct, I think, a core part of Spinoza's argument that would actually lead to this claim of enthusiasm, right? So in proposition 47 of Ethics 2, he states that the human mind has an adequate knowledge of the eternal and infinite essence of God. But in the scholium of 36.5, he says that although we know by reason that everything depends on God, this proof does not affect the mind. This inoperative character of the adequate and innate idea of God is contrasted with a general tendency for imagining God inadequately, a kind of imagination that strikes the mind more often. So for Spinoza, we can have an adequate idea of God, but this idea is sort of inoperative. It doesn't function. It doesn't naturally makes us know. It doesn't strike the mind more as often as it should. And then in Ethics 5, a key mechanism for the development of one's freedom is to recognize the idea of the effects with the aid of the imagination, so that the ideas of the mind are related to the adequate idea of God. The result is then the adequate idea of the eternal and infinite essence of God becoming operative, affecting the individual, that is the body-mind complex as a whole. Adequately imagining God is thought as a strategy for operating transformations with respect to how one lives and how one experiences the relations with others and society more generally. So for Spinoza, the mind inadequately and commonly imagines God as an anthropomorphic being, as a ruler that rewards and punishes, and as an all-knowing being with teleological intentions for every creature. However, the eternal and infinite essence of God is that of a single self-created substance that has infinite attributes and is apprehended by the mind as being composed of thought and extension that infinitely changes itself into finite modes. So Spinoza's naturalism is the defense of an immanent monism, and he could not, I think, ever escape the claim of enthusiasm, because for Spinoza, we do have an adequate knowledge of God, and cognition is supposed to be an organization of the interplay between imagination and reason, such that we can be acting according to this adequate idea of God. So intellectual circles of the 17th century Europe rejected this idea, considering atheistic and mystical. But according to Spinoza, they were the ones imagining God differently, and that's all. So sorry for it being all over the place.
Thank you, Nastassja, for this picture of a really early, very early, maybe the earliest reception of Spinoza, even so early reception that we deal in the case of Conway with Spinoza before Spinoza, because Nastassja exposed the hypothesis of circulation of the ethic in its unaccomplished form or summarized form, and so this is interesting because we deal through Conway with something we don't know because we only can read the final version of the ethics. So it is also interesting because we see how in a context in which there is no previous mediation, I mean, there is not a fixed image of Spinoza or Spinozism. What do they do with this strange philosophy? I mean, how do they use it, or how do they refute it? Or Natasha has also shown us the difficulties of this, well, not the difficulties maybe, but anyway, of this reception. I mean, when she, for instance, told us how More tried to refute Spinoza, evoking the demonology or phantoms, etc. Anyway, I don't want to. I am not the one who wants to speak, and if there are questions, I see something in the chat, and so I see also, yes, Daniel simply thanks, and so yes, please.
May I? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. I'll ask later.
No, you start. Go, please.
Okay, so this is a kind of clarificatory question for me. So the charge of enthusiasm, you say it's rooted in Spinoza's belief that we have an adequate idea of God. And could you explain to me, and this is where I'm going to sound dumb, but what they mean by the enthusiasm there? What is the, does it fit with this religious conception of enthusiasm? I don't quite, I'm not able to make the connection.
Mm-hmm. So what I think that they are
saying. Can I add something? I just add something because enthusiasm is criticized in England by, I don't know, almost everybody, because there was the Civil War, and so Hobbes, for instance, speaks of enthusiasm as a kind of craziness, the pretension of speaking with God, and it's the beginning of the destruction of civil state. And so I share Daniel's concern with the attribution of enthusiasm to Spinoza.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so what do they mean by enthusiasm? They mean the ability to actually speaks truly about God's workings, right? So, but if as much as we know nature, the more we know nature, the more we know God. Speaking truly about nature, in one sense, is also speaking truly about God's workings, right? Knowing natural laws is sort of speaking truly about God's workings. So this is, of course, is where the dispute on how to interpret Spinoza appears, right? Whether knowing nature is actually to know God, right? There's a dispute right there, since God is, has infinite attributes, and we just know partially by means of our as modes of thought and extension. So this is where the interpretative issue lies, but I don't. That's not my worry. What I think it's interesting is how they read Spinoza as an enthusiast, and what does that mean? So it means that according to Spinoza's philosophy, one actually has the ability to speak truly. One has the ability to, but more specifically, to speak God's language in the sense of knowing adequately God and being able to express it discursively. And this is what the collegians would call free prophesizing, right? So anyone with adequate ideas could actually read the scriptures and become prophets. So every person would have the epistemological framework that is needed to prophesize, to receive the vision of the good and of truth, and to talk about it. So this is the claim of enthusiasm. It starts from this idea that of Spinoza, that we have an innate, adequate idea of God. And in Ethics 5, if we can organize our imagination and actually build further adequate ideas based on the our understanding of adequate understanding of God, then we actually can be enthusiastically true, speak truly. So that's what the claim of enthusiasm is about. So both Conway and Moore are trying to sort of get detached from it in their own ways. For Moore, only prophets are able to be God intoxicated, have the vision and prophesize.
Good.
Due to their boniform faculty and stuff like that.
So that makes sense. So the worry, if I think what threw me off is this idea of speaking, because I think there is in Spinoza this ineffable, the intellectual activity should be distinct from the imaginative one, so it's not going to be part of language and speech. But if I understand it, the worry they might be having, and I am asking for clarification, this is what I'm not telling you, this is what I'm thinking, is that, yeah, it does fit with this Protestant notion that one grasps God independently of the church or authorities or the prophets, and that seems, yeah, that makes sense. So the enthusiasm seems strange. I always think of like, people handling snakes or speaking in tongues, but I guess I can see, sure, the intellectual grasp that Spinoza is presenting does allow for this independence from tradition, scripture, and so on. So thank you. That's a neat point.
And so, Emanuele.
Yes, unless there's someone else who wants to go, because you're gonna hear my voice later a lot. So I'm happy to yield, but I'm gonna go ahead. So thank you so much for this paper. I've also worked on Conway for a while, and I've worked on Spinoza for a longer while. And for the first time in what you were saying, I started having a bit of a better realization of the idea. I think you called it perfectivism. So like the idea that for Conway, by imagining ourselves as better, we eventually catch up, right? We eventually do become better and transform our essence. We can. There is an open door for that. And so I was thinking, would that be, how are your thoughts on this being some form of parallel with the idea of free man and the exemplar that we find in the Ethics of, having this, because Spinoza is clear that these are not rational, I don't think, models, but they're like, they work with maxims to catch our imagination, our physical knowledge, whatever that is. So do you see a similarity here with the idea of becoming better by imagining yourself as better and having in mind an example?
So thank you for the question. My investigations on Conway's epistemology are also, rudimentary. I am writing another paper on this topic, And it is really not clear, the distinction she makes between imagination and reason. It's not, at least it's not as clear as Spinoza's, right? But we can deduce some things, and it seems that for her, if we imagine ourselves better, we are able to transform our essence. But I think that the main, so in one sense, when it comes to reception studies and comparative philosophy, is very different. It's very difficult to not to attribute to an author what tradition has already said. So I'm very careful in saying what's the difference between imagination and reason in Conway, because I don't want to attribute to her like general traditional views on imagination and reason by thinking that I'm actually deriving them from the text, and actually I'm not. I'm actually putting more things in the text than the text allows. So I actually wouldn't want to talk about that. I think that what is more interesting to see is how they are worried about like different objectives. So for Spinoza, the free man does not think about death as he thinks about life, right? So for Spinoza is offering a philosophy for the everyday, right? He wants to free man from external authority, and he wants to free man from superstition, and build an autonomous being that also recognizes the power of living in society. So it's an autonomous being that is in relation, right, with his own time and with other people. So the free man actually wants to act better right here, right now. But Conway, in this sense, she's a very Platonist of Cambridge. she's in this context of theological thinking, sort of. For her, the idea is to become a better being in general, even if this means in the afterlife. So she thinks that we can perfect ourselves and actually become a different individual, in the sense of human beings can transform themselves into beasts, dogs and horses and other like beings, material beings. So I think the time frame of freedom that she's taking into account is much larger than Spinoza's, because for Spinoza, we are finite beings, and we have this kind of small lifespan, and when it's done, so we should live right here, right now. But for Conway, no, we can like become angels, and that's good for you. For you, Emanuele, for me, Nastassja, to become something else and something better. She just puts limits to that, because we cannot become Christ, right? We can become like Christ, but we cannot achieve the maximum perfection. So I think that's, I guess it's the most interesting difference, because she's thinking in the afterlife, and Spinoza is thinking about, politics and how we can live a better life right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Natasha. And given it is for you 5 in the morning, you are allowed to leave now.
Thank you. I'm so sorry about that. Thank you, Francesco, for having me.
I will maybe write you again, because there is the idea of publishing something, and so maybe this will not be the last time you hear from us. So, but you will see.
Last time in general.
Thank you.
There is a lot.
And now let's hear Emanuele Costa, who is assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. He worked largely on Spinoza's metaphysics, mereology, or idea of organism, but also on Leibniz. And so now we hear his talk about Coleridge, and the title is A Spinozian Turn Leibnizian, Samule Coleridge and Divine Utopias. And where you when you'll have only 5 minutes, I'll tell you. Okay.
Okay. Perfect. All right. So first of all, let me thank Francesco for organizing this, and Alessio for organizing this. This is an incredible attempt at at kind of streamlining the reception of Spinoza. I'm very happy to be part of it, especially with so many people who I know and esteem. And in fact, I did steal this, the occasion for talking about Coleridge and Spinoza together from Jack, who has a beautiful paper on the subject. Okay, so that was the thanking part. The second caveat that I would like to put before you, because this has happened in another talk, before I begin, is that I'm going to speak of Spinoza in terms of a conservative in terms of political philosophy. We can talk about that in the Q&A more in detail, but I just wanted to say that, at least from Coleridge's point of view, Spinoza is an anti-revolutionary, is an anti-rebel. And that already puts him more in the conservative once you take into account what Coleridge was going through at the end of the 18th century. All right, so that was the caveat. So I'm going to start by saying that Coleridge represents a paradigmatic figure for the cultural turn that involved most of the European landscape at the turn of the 19th century. This intellectual revolution entailed a transformation of the Weltanschauung of the rationalist ideas belonging to the previous eras into what is known as a romantic worldview. Much like his continental analogues, such as Goethe or Stendhal, Coleridge was educated and formed within the most advanced laboratories of rationalistic thought. And in this essay, I attempt to clarify how these initial tendencies of Coleridge morphed into the convictions that today we just consider, okay, that's a staple of Romanticism. A particular noteworthy example of this mutation is represented by by Coleridge's lifelong fascination with the figure of Baruch Spinoza, which at this point was almost mythological in the libertine and radical circles. Why? Because he represented an ideal character to inspire the rationalistic pantheon. In the hagiographic reconstruction of his life that were circulating in the 18th century, he had become a renegade Jew who had been expelled from the synagogue and relegated to the outskirts of the intellectual community because of his unwillingness to bend his intellect to any polluting influence coming from the world of experience. Moreover, Spinoza and his monist metaphysics had become a paradigm useful for those unsatisfied with the transcendent inclinations of religious practice and theory. The monist approach that Spinoza was offering, in the simplification that both his detractors and supporters were reading or thinking, represented a straightforward alternative to transcendent faith. He provided metaphysically unimpeachable grounds to sustain some form of pantheism or panentheism that was more appealing to the young intellectuals that populated the benches in Cambridge, in Leipzig, and in Jena. In the first section of the paper, I will trace how Coleridge came to know Spinoza in his formative years and throughout the end of the 1790s. It will be important to distinguish how Coleridge remains close to the standard reception of Spinoza as a philosopher with almost exclusive interest in metaphysics. That was the image that was circulating around that time, while largely opposing Spinoza's attitudes in political philosophy that were almost unread. Spinoza was in fact a political realist, keen to maintain the balance between right and potency. Coleridge, on the other hand, was a political utopist, and I'll say a little more about that. In the second section of the paper, I will illustrate how this divide between Coleridge and Spinoza became larger after the 1800s, in the 1800s and 1810s. Coleridge approached philosophies that reserved a greater space to the creator spirit, such as Leibniz and Kant, and contemporary reined in his pantheism to embrace a more traditional version of Christianity. And at the same time, this was the time where Coleridge came closer to the historical Spinoza in terms of political philosophy, because he started rejecting utopian thinking and embracing a more anti-revolutionary approach that was whose main intent was to preserve the liberty of the intellectual. So the two thinkers, I argue, were never on the same page, because when Coleridge was closer to Spinoza in terms of metaphysics and philosophy of religion, he was farther from Spinoza in terms of politics. And then when he reined in his metaphysical conservatism, he became more like Spinoza in political as well. So let's start with section 1, which I called The Young Poet, the Old Pantheism. So Coleridge showed great interest towards the pantheistic strand of philosophy from a very young age. His fascination with Spinoza's particular brand of panentheism is significantly showcased in the last decade of the 18th century, and at the beginning, first 3-4 years of the 19th. And it demonstrates an interesting British resonance of the German pantheismus trait, which I assume is what Jack will talk at length about. On the continent, the 1780s and 90s had this intense debate regarding the possibility of pantheism and the possibility of reconciling at least parts of it with Christian faith. The debate famously included names as Moses Mendelssohn, Herder, Lessing, Jacobi, Goethe, and indirectly Kant as well. In particular, we know that Coleridge probably came to engage with Spinoza through the commentary penned by Jacobi, Über die Lehre de Spinoza, published in 1785. Coleridge, along with some German contemporaries, sought to interpret Spinoza's metaphysics in accord to Christianity. His understanding of Spinoza was thus intended as a redirection of pantheism towards more spiritualistic attitudes. So when you start reading Coleridge on Spinoza, as a Spinozist, the sensation is that it's a collation of panpsychist themes mixed with metaphysical and ontological monism. It's not quite Spinoza, but it emphasizes the spirituality of it. So in the late 1790s, Coleridge was reading Spinoza, as he testifies in a letter to Robert Southey, and he says, "I am sunk in Spinoza, as undisturbed as a toad on a rock." And from his later annotations, we know that Coleridge at that point had read Spinoza in the Paulus edition, which had attached, interestingly, Coleridge's biography of Spinoza. And this biography can be read as a rehabilitation of Spinoza's figure, which had been, as we've just heard, throughout the 1600s, being criticized as, heretical, atheistic, etc., etc. Instead, Coleridge, what he does, he associates Spinoza with some kind of Christian sects, such as the Armenians and the Mennonites. Coleridge, who was himself roaming at the outskirts of organized Christianity at that time and had developed some sort of proximity with Quakers and Unitarians, would have approved this form of Christianization of Spinoza, which he saw as not in contrast with pantheism. In fact, Coleridge found an interesting form of utilizing Christianity to, here, support Spinoza's monism. In a letter to Reverend Estlin, dated 1803, Coleridge argues that to recognize dualism, may that be, classical form-matter dualism or Cartesian dualism, perpetuating dualism is equal for Coleridge to fall into idolatry or Manichaeism, because you would be introducing multiple eternal principles. Similarly, even to create a radical distinction between God and created beings means to fracture the infinite continuity of God. And to support this argumentation, Coleridge quotes a text from the scripture, and specifically the dictum that's attributed to Paul in the Acts. In him, in God, we live and move and have our being. Interestingly, as you probably know, this verse is also the one that Spinoza famously quotes in a letter to Oldenburg, letter 73. And this letter, Wonder, Wonder, was included in the Opera Omnia, so not in the Paulus edition, in the Opera Omnia that we know Coleridge had read and annotated by 1813. So Coleridge's brand of spiritualism can be read as a variation on Spinoza's panentheism. The expression of God through the attributes and modes, which never breaks the unity of the monist metaphysical God, will certainly have appealed to Coleridge's sensitivity, because he was searching for a philosophy that allowed him to systematize his belief in a united and synergic universe. As we have already seen, Coleridge pushed himself as far as criticizing almost all Christian confessions on the basis of this tenet. To break monism means to fall into idolatry. The alleged compatibility of Spinozism and Christianity was clear for Coleridge at least until 1819, when in a philosophical lecture he affirmed that the theological hatred of his name, of Spinoza's name, is one of the most incomprehensible parts of philosophical research. For Spinoza was originally a Jew, and he held the opinions of the most learned Jews, particularly the Kabbalistic philosophers. And he was also of the most pure and exemplary life. As it has been said of him, if he did not think as a Christian, he felt and acted like one. So this connection between Spinoza and Kabbalism, or rather the Christianized version of Kabbalism, elaborated by Van Helmont and other esoteric thinkers of the era, had been commonplace throughout the late 1700s. People reading Spinoza and reading Kabbalah would often assume that Spinoza was just a very talented Kabbalist. And this scorned a lot of Christian thinkers, such as Anne Conway, who wanted to convert the teachings of the Kabbalah to Christianity. So far, we have a brief sketch of Coleridge's alignment with what we could define as a spiritualized, religionized version of Spinoza's metaphysics, one that was very popular throughout the 18th century. To the credit of his intellectual honesty, the poet Coleridge was aware that there was something unoriginal and derivative there. He makes a very wonderful remark that I really want to share with you. In the fragments, he says, "I never yet knew a single person whom Spinoza had ever converted to his way of thinking. But I know half a dozen, at least, who have converted Spinoza to theirs." And this is so sorely true still today. So Coleridge was, in this way, more honest about Spinoza's metaphysics. He was aware that it was impossible to really reconcile Spinoza and Christianity, and that's why he moved away from Spinoza. But I'm going to argue that even when he was at his most Spinozistic in terms of metaphysics and religion, Coleridge consistently and consciously avoided any confrontation with the least, let's say, convenient domain of Spinoza's thought, which is the theological political. Spinoza's views on the structure that binds political societies together are known to be radically realist and certainly not revolutionary. There are even debates in the literature that challenge whether or not Spinoza was actually endorsing liberty of speech, because sometimes the bar seems to be set at freedom of thought as the last unimpeachable human right. So in the TTP, which Coleridge must have read, right? He was reading the Opera Omnia, is more revolutionary. The TTP is revolutionary regarding the interpretation of the sacred scripture, as we've just heard from Nastassja. But it's not really challenging for most social orders. It grants the governing body significant elbow room in controlling the population, and it even argues for the political control of organized religion. So this kind of control that was cementing the status quo and the existing social order, that's what Coleridge started questioning in the years of his youth. He was associated with several radical political groups operating in England. In particular, we know that Coleridge was one of the founders of an organization that called itself Pantisocracy, the society where all are equal, whose main goal was the foundation of a utopian society based on what we would call today quasi-socialist or anarchist tenets. The ideal location for this utopian settlement was quickly identified as a patch of deserted and uninhabited land in modern-day Pennsylvania. And we have evidence that preparations for the voyage occupied a good portion of Coleridge's time in the 1790s. This very fact should make us realize the depth of the difference on political grounds that separates Coleridge from Spinoza. In fact, Spinoza despised all utopian efforts based on the possibility of purely rational deliberation, because he describes that this is unrealistic, and he even calls it satirical in the TP. As Smith puts it, Spinoza's realism derives from his awareness of the ubiquity of the affects. The fact that passions are not eliminable and the necessity of taking them into account when designing ethics was for Spinoza a crucial philosophical tenet. The goal of political philosophy for Spinoza is to analyze government within the realm of passion without cutting them out and hoping for the best. It is then all the more striking that Coleridge, that was so fascinated with Spinoza in terms of metaphysics, saw as desirable and attainable a perspective that would attempt to eliminate antisocial passions, which stem from a chronic frustration of desire. So the goal of the Pantisocratic utopian community was to nurture virtuous passions and to radically redistribute property. This return to a newly imagined state of nature would have probably been very suspicious for Spinoza, right? He refused to acknowledge any radical separation between the state of nature and the civil state on the basis of his naturalism. What is more, Coleridge's association with known radicals who sought to establish enclaves of relative independence from the English government would have been chastised by Spinoza, who famously opposed the creation of any states within the state. The fragmentation and dissolution of political authority was regarded by Spinoza as an act of rebellion, which he condemned both in the TTP and in the TP, even though he recognized the need for some degree of dialogue between subjects and government. So the mature Coleridge later will prove to have learned this Spinoza's lesson, and we'll see that in a moment, because he distanced himself from all radical and rebel groups. By contrast, this conservative attitude will distance him from Spinoza's panentheist metaphysics, reinserting Coleridge in talks about providence, idealism, and metaphysical individuality grounded in spiritual unity. So I'm going to now move to the second section, which is the major poet, the New Hope. With the turn of the century, and more specifically during the 1810s, Coleridge began to drift away from the more radical groups he had frequented in his youth. However, his dampened enthusiasm for revolutionary political projects only represented half of his philosophical evolution. The other half is a modified attitude towards pantheism, a shifting from one extreme of the philosophical spectrum to the next. So Coleridge actually gives us, in a beautiful page, the coordinates to identify where he is on the spectrum. So he describes Spinoza's panentheism as the apex representative of the philosophy of it is, whereas Kant is the best of the philosophers of the I am. So there's this contraposition between objective and subjective, between human and Let's call it being. So he says, and I'm quoting, "Only two systems of philosophy are possible. The first is Spinoza, the second is Kant. The first is absolute, the second is relative. The kat ontos onta and the kat anthropo, or ontosophical and anthropological." So he distances himself from the ontosophical end of the spectrum, which inescapably led to Spinoza for him, but he did not quite embrace Kantian philosophy fully. Perhaps he still had too much panentheism in his system. So before we get into that, though, let's take a detour and let's see what the political Coleridge is doing at this time. He rejected radical political movements, and he actually denounced the twin errors of accommodating the passions too much and at the same time exacerbating them by repressing them. And this, to my mind, reads just like Spinozism. His proposed solution in the second period of his life versed instead on the possibility of regulating passions through rationality, a capacity that, according to this newly found elitist Coleridge, belonged to the thinking and disinterested patriots who could discipline the heart and prepare it for the love of all mankind. So this appeal to reason might sound a little too intellectualistic to find any support in Spinoza's decidedly realistic political philosophy. Nonetheless, the appeal to what Coleridge described as reconciliations between rational judgment and sociable sentiments is still opposed to any hasty subjugation of the passions, right? So Coleridge appeals to this regulation of the passion not in an intellectualistic fashion, what Descartes could have done, but much closer to the way Spinoza does, by taking equal care of establishing the careful balance of passions and reason. Spinoza, in fact, equally denounced any utopistic attempt to submit passion through what he calls an impossible mastery, and the tragedies caused by the unregulated sovereignty of the passions of the multitude. So now we get into how theatrical, how performative Coleridge was. In a letter dated October 1803, Coleridge claimed, hear this, to have never been part of any radical society, and even further, that he had disclaimed all these societies, these imperia in imperio, states within the state, these parasitic worms in the bowels of the state, subsisting on the weakness and diseasedness, and having for their final object the death of the states. All these societies I abhorred, always abhorred, as wicked conspiracies. So apart from the fact that this is obviously false, we have all the records that he was a very radical politician before. What's interesting for the historian of philosophy, such as us, is that he's implicitly referencing Spinoza's naturalism, right? With the phrase, creating a state within the state. In chapter 17 of the TTP, Spinoza offers a criticism of the figure of the rebel, entirely based on this idea that rebellion is a state, creates a state within the state, and thus threatens the unity and survival of the state. So Coleridge, despite his past as an active radical and as a utopian thinker, seems to have absorbed Spinoza's lesson in his older age, and he starts addressing rebels as the cause of the disaggregation of the state. In fact, aggregation and disaggregation, these two key processes of what we could call an organic genesis, seem to be a crucial preoccupation for the mature Coleridge, not just from the political standpoint, but from the point of view of metaphysics as well. His reflection on the concept of life and the biological underpinning of spiritual existence intensified after the death of his infant son in 1799, and he cried out his dissatisfaction, his disamourment with Spinoza's organizational monism. He says, and I quote, "Life, power, being, organization may and probably is their effect. Their cause it cannot be." Instead, Spinoza, as we know, repeatedly pointed at the union and agreement of parts from the ethics, specifically in the Physical Excursus to letter 32. Spinoza does this. He believes that the agreement of parts and the unifying force that they carry makes realistic, makes possible the metaphysical weight of monism, and explain the transition from the simplest bodies to the universal being, facies totius universi. By contrast, Coleridge, in line with the spirit of his time, begins a refutation of such organicist tenets that shall enable an ultimate shift away from metaphysical Spinozism and panentheism. Where does he find the tools for this? Well, he aligns with German idealism. Coleridge actually started developing what he described as an overcoming of the Spinozistic project, and he named that theory of life. And as you can imagine, this is clearly evoking the Naturphilosophie of Schellingian memory. The originality displayed by Coleridge in this context concentrates on his insistence that the multiplicity, or as he calls it, the multeity, of organic composites requires a unifying force holding together the organism. And yet the metaphysical value of this unity is not represented by its belonging to the subjective real, as in Schelling. Coleridge instead criticizes subjectivism from the path, because it deviates from the path of real unity. And he says subjective idealism, Schelling, for example, is just an echo, is just a knockoff version of Berkeley and Giordano Bruno. Even calls Schelling a Plotinized Spinozist, which is one of the best insults I've ever heard. So as Coleridge strains away from the Spinozistic bottom-up corporeal organizational paradigm and refuses subjectivism and idealism, the question on the table is, how do you develop this metaphysics? How can Coleridge characterize his personal views of unity without falling in the twin perils of pantheism or idealism? The answer to this question seems to lie in his relationship with Leibniz, that is often underestimated. The reason for the scholarly neglect, so that we don't quite read Coleridge and Leibniz together, is explained by the lack of any explicit reference to Leibniz in Coleridge. And yet, we can witness the fascination that Coleridge had with Leibniz in more than a few pages of the Biographia Literaria. Throughout this monumental work that Coleridge wrote in the latter part of his life, Coleridge uses a method of reflection that is unique, very unique, and characteristic of this style. He copied and translated long quotes, often entire paragraphs or sections of other thinkers' work, and then changes a few words in them, interpolating them with his own interpretation. And this has led to a debate that I will not get into today, but that you might find interesting. That is, people didn't read Coleridge as a philosopher, specifically because most of his philosophical works are created with this kind of molding together of quotes and passages from other philosophers. So he does this in the Biographia Literaria with Spinoza, of course, with Schelling, with Schlegel, and Jacobi. And in each of these cases, Coleridge goes deep and restates, re-elaborates, and modifies these sources in order to incorporate them into the rather loose system that he's creating. However, he doesn't do that with Leibniz. With Leibniz, it's a literally copy and paste from the éclaircissement de difficulté que Monsieur Bayle a trouvé dans le système nouveau de l'union de l'âme et du corps, right? That's Leibniz, and Coleridge takes this work from Leibniz and literally copies it in the Biographia Literaria. It's chapter 12. He actually translates it, but you're going to see that there's a little bit of edge there. So he's asking, how can we gain all the good things that Spinoza offers us and synthesize them with a more with a more complete view of the universe that doesn't fall into organicism or atheism. So he says, Leibniz says, and Coleridge as well, they say, the deeper we penetrate into the grounds of things, the more truth we discover in the doctrines of the greater number of philosophical sects. The want of substantial reality in the objects, according to the skeptics, the harmonies or numbers through the Pythagoreans and Platonists, the one and all of Parmenides and Plotinus without Spinozism, the necessary connection of things according to the Stoics, and the vital philosophy of the Kabbalists and Hermetists, who assume the universality of sensation. The substantial forms and entelechies of Aristotle and the scholastics, together with the mechanical solution of all particular phenomena according to Democritus and Descartes. All of these, this huge grocery list, we shall find united in one perspective central point, which shows regularity and a coincidence of all the parts in the very object, which from every point of view must appear confused and distorted. The spirit of sectarianism has been our fault and the cause of our failures. We have imprisoned our own conceptions by the lines which we've drawn in order to exclude the conceptions of others. And then he quotes a passage in French, directly from Leibniz. Je trouvais que la plupart des sectes ont raison d'une bonne partie de ce qu'elles avancent, mais non pas tant en ce qu'elles nient. How are these appeals to the unanimity of philosophical research helpful for us when we're trying to assess Coleridge as he migrates from Spinozism into this new system? Well, in chapter 12, what Coleridge says he's doing, he's trying to elaborate this idea of an immediately transparent, so apperceptive, natural consciousness, which radically divides all experiences and all philosophies, just like the Alps divided Gallia in his example. So he says, and I'm quoting, as the elder Romans distinguished their northern provinces into Cisalpine and Transalpine, so may we divide all the objects of human knowledge into those on this side and those on the other side of the spontaneous consciousness. He calls that citra et transconscientiam communem. The latter is exclusively the domain of pure philosophy, which is therefore properly entitled transcendental, in order to discriminate it at once both from mere reflection and representation on the one hand, and on the other from those flights of lawless speculation which abandoned by all distinct consciousness, because transgressing the bound and purposes of our intellectual faculties, are justly condemned as transcendent. So, what is this achieving? Well, for Coleridge, this is the crucial piece that's missing in idealism. By confusing transcendental consciousness and natural consciousness, Schelling and his compatriots cannot provide a sufficient reason for the unity of the multiplicity of the parts that compose the objective body, which refers to the subjective self. The problem, as Coleridge states it in his context, is that either we take the objective at first, and then we have to account for the supervention of the subjective, which coalesces with it, or we take the subjective as primary, and then the problem is how there supervenes to it a coincident objective. This preoccupation, for Coleridge as for Leibniz, is to assess the apparently homogeneous field of external perception that come to the subject as facts of life, as he says, and to find within this apparently continuous phenomenon the ground for a differentiation, a principium individuationis. The answer to the query is notoriously for Leibniz that each monad has a contradistinctive set of perceptions as a spiritual substance, what he calls a qualitative detail. I'm winding down, I promise. So Coleridge's answer, in turn, is considerably more extreme. The radicality of his individuation process, the principium individuationis, might be perhaps explained through an overreaction to Spinoza and Schelling, which Coleridge came to reject and seek refuge from. Consider Spinoza and the twofold assessment of causality that we have in at the end of Ethics 1. On one hand, Spinoza affirms the immanent causation and involvement of God in the production of all singular things. Proposition 29. In nature, there's nothing contingent, but all things have been determined from the necessity of the divine nature to exist and produce an effect in a certain way. On the other hand, however, Spinoza also maintains a mandatory and necessary structure of proximate and transient causation in order to determine finite beings into existence. Proposition 28. Every singular thing can neither exist nor be determined to produce an effect unless it's determined to exist and produce an effect by another cause, which is also finite and has a determinate existence. Compare these tenets with the Coleridgean attitude towards individuation and determination that he was writing about in a notebook in 1827. Every creature below man, this is crucial, plant, insect, or animal, is the joint product of the inherent and the circumstantial nature. In all things, they are simply recipients, in all things done by them, simply instruments. Need I declare that whatever is beneficent or lovely in the nature, law, order, beauty, kindness, and kindly delight, is produced by the word of the Most High, constraining and controlling nature, and without which there were no nature, but only the dust, blank multati. By nature, I mean multati related to number, and the numerus numerator unitas et parens numerorum numerantium quod in celis sunt is the word. So as you can see, he mixes languages a lot, but I think this passage is, for me, very interesting for several reasons. First of all, the fact that Coleridge begins from a rather Spinozistic starting point, right? Saying finite things are the joint effect of inherent and circumstantial or transitive causation. The passage echoes the twin determinations that we saw in Proposition 28 and 29. However, there's one feature of this text of Coleridge that is decidedly anti-Spinozistic, and that is the exclusion of man from the order of nature, a thesis that is radically opposed to Spinoza's metaphysics. While for Spinoza each human being is just another finite mode, so embedded within the set of transient causation, Coleridge, following the Leibnizian reaction to Spinoza, sets human nature apart from the rest of natura naturata in proportion to the human capacity for rational thought and spiritual unity. Consciousness cannot be considered as a result of organization, as Coleridge put it. The insistence on the crucial role played by numerical identity and on the possibility of unifying multiplicity through logical and intentional capacity is, to my eyes, clearly Leibnizian. And what is also Leibnizian is the firm belief of the providential design that brings about states of affairs. Coleridge, according to Webster, thought of nature as an element of earthly life that is being continually saved by God's illuminating word from relapsing into the state of Hadean chaos. Accordingly, any contrary opposition lay not between God and nature, but between God and Hades, the ground which by the power of the word of God becomes nature. So Coleridge is opposing chaos, Hades, and assumes that it is possible to have a transition into cosmos through God's function as an optimizer, akin to the creator role that he assumes in Leibniz. For Leibniz, in fact, God's main function as creator is to enact the highest logically possible number of intelligences, for they allow a synthesization of multiplicity unavailable within chaos, within matter. So the universe itself is teleological oriented for Leibniz, and he says, cosmic justice is rooted in individual monadic self-actualization. And this is the passage that Coleridge was commenting on. The unifying force of the spiritual monad allows the Leibnizian God to mold order from circumstances, cosmos from chaos, telos from Hades. Alternatively, for the mature Coleridge, nature, he says, physiologically contemplated, begins, proceeds, and ends in contradiction. You can't just have a physiological understanding of nature. You need providence. As Coleridge repeats in the Biographia Literaria, the Leibnizian response to empiricism, there's nothing in the mind that doesn't come from the senses, except for the mind itself, constitutes the distinct, original, and creative role of what we may call the human exception. So, the search for a telos within the Spinozian non-providential universe led Coleridge to rediscover the uniqueness of humanity. And unsurprisingly, wonder, wonder, the poet stands as a perfect human, a nexus of sense and spirituality, and the apparently irresolvable multity of physiology. The figure of the poet thus represents for the mature Coleridge a punctual embodiment of natura naturans, just like Leibniz had fragmented the Spinozian substance in each individual monad. This creative capacity of the human spirit is highlighted by Coleridge's insistence in this period, in all of his writing, on the metaphor of the mirror as a signifier capable of expressing the connection between God and man. So the mirror is the man who can reflect God. The mind, he says, is the source of the capacity for union with the divine. It is not a contingent characteristic of humanity. It's its defining element. It's its essential property. Again, the use of the metaphor and the persistence of this language is Leibnizian. At its core, the idea of living mirrors relating divinity and humanity is famously a crucial idea for Leibniz. So the creative mantle of the traditional God is assumed now also by the human spirit, endowed with this capacity of teleological orienting multati. So, and he says, channeling the self-circling pattern into a productive direction. Coleridge ultimately completely apostatized Spinoza. He abandoned Spinoza and seals this complete abandonment when he introduces these teleological notions and the notion of potentiality, which Spinoza abhorred. In fact, nature is infinite potentiality for Coleridge's theory of nature. The only naturans actor are the word as a cosmic director and the human poetic spirit in its capacity as sense giver and unifier of the multiplicity. Thank you.
Thank you, Emanuele. So thank you for your talk, which was very interesting and put on the stage not only Spinoza and Coleridge, but also other conceptual characters as Leibniz or German idealism, and which made us see the, sorry, there is somebody writing me, the interplay between perceived or real proximities and real or anyway interpreted distances. And so I don't want to abuse of your patience, and if there are questions, I would leave the word to the public. If not, I start with a.
I think Daniel was trying to.
Yeah, yeah. I could ask a quick question. That's all right. It's on the early comments about the political views of Coleridge. So I wanted to know more about the society he wanted to construct in Pennsylvania, and whether that really would qualify as this sort of utopian society utopianism that he criticizes later on in life and denies he was ever a part of. And my reasoning for this is, while Spinoza is famously anti-utopian, he also in the Ethics makes a big point about, look, you need a community of like-minded individuals who are rational, whose sentiments will support each other, and so on. And so the idea of a bunch of creative philosophical types getting together to live in a community doesn't strike me as necessarily an anti-Spinozistic sentiment. I mean, it could be, but I was curious if there's further details that kind of got left out of the talk for the sake of time.
Yeah, so there definitely are. So Coleridge was very active as a radical politician. In fact, he was a disturber of the peace, literally, when he was, there were incidents that happened around his philosophical and political lectures at Cambridge that might have been part of what pushed him away from that. But again, a disturber of the peace, a predicator, a preacher of radical politics doesn't sound quite Spinozistic, right? The whole idea of Spinoza, yes, is to construct a community of individuals, but the whole idea of tearing a state apart, maybe I'm reading too much into the TTP and the TP, but I do have this sense that Spinoza wants to avoid rebellion, wants to avoid fragmentation. So there's that as a gut feeling for me, and yeah, I'm not sure that Spinoza would have wanted a separation from the vulgus so radical that you go off and fund your own state. But I'm open to be disillusioned about this point.
Yeah, I don't have radically strong feelings against it. I guess the thought is just there's a couple comments where he so I agree. Maintaining the state's crucially important for Spinoza, and we shouldn't tear it apart, right? He's against civil war and all that type of stuff. But he makes clear, hey, the conditions of nature can change. He comes from the Van den Eden group of radicals. So there's a sense of, and just in normal politics, one person's radical is another person's conservative or anti-reactionary. Yeah. So maybe Coleridge would really see Spinoza as this conservative, but I'm not sure.
The other point that I think really strung me along those lines is how intellectualistic the proposed governance of passions is, right? There's this idea that it is possible to press them down and make them disappear, which sounds radically anti-Spinozistic to me, right? The whole idea of Spinoza is to take man as it is, not as we wish it to be. There's the whole criticism to Descartes in the Ethics is about that.
Okay, but thank you.
No, thank you.
But why did you? I'm sorry. My in Italian I would have said that in a nicer way. But why are you confusing to be an utopian and to be a rebel? Because in the first 19th century in US, you could have ground a new community without needing to rebel to anybody. I mean, there was space enough, and there were community also, religious or political communities, closed political communities who didn't disturb anybody.
Right. So the other thing that I left out of the talk because of the huge, it would have taken just as long. There's actually a book right there that's all about Coleridge's activism in politics and creating disturbances of the peace. So maybe you're right. Maybe this focus that I have on utopia is a personal idiosyncrasy for me.
No, you can say Spinoza is anti-utopistic.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Like the fact that Coleridge was utopistic doesn't mean that he was a rebel.
Yeah, I mean, doesn't mean it was a rebel in Spinoza's sense, where against the state.
Yeah. But there were so many other attempts that he did at funding radical publications, at creating secret societies in London and in Cambridge, at mobilizing people to resist to the government at that point. Maybe he was just fascinated by the French Revolution, and so he was thinking along those lines. But no, I take your point. Like,
I mean, this imply a methodological question, because, okay, and I am very sensible, because I think there is not one Spinoza in se, and there are tensions inside Spinoza, and so, and these tensions make the opposite interpretation possible in a certain extent. And so, of course, you have the Hobbesian Spinoza, who says, okay, acting against the state and the laws is absurd. But at the same time, you have the same Spinoza who says that the power is right is power, and so if the state has no power, then it's right to rebel against him. And it's the same Spinoza who, at the end of TTP, speak of this honest and pious and virtuous rebel, who is the martyr of freedom of philosophizing. And so, yes, you certainly know that there are revolutionary readings of Spinoza.
Absolutely.
And so the methodological question is, if you speak, I mean, this is the question of reception. The fact that, of course, one must, in a certain extent, take his Spinoza as the real Spinoza. But this is what everybody does. And also Coleridge, and so this is this means to accept oneself from the methodological caution you take for the others. And so this is Spinoza, while Coleridge one is not. And so I don't know if I made the point.
I completely get it, and you are correct in terms of historical methodology. I see your point. I guess especially Coleridge sees your point, right? When he says that wonderful quote that I don't know anybody who Spinoza convinced, but I know that at least 12 people that have been convinced that have converted Spinoza to their own philosophy, right? That for me is the truest sentence that I've ever heard in my years of studying Spinoza. So there is that. I'll give you that. Absolutely. What I think is interesting, and then I'm gonna probably close unless there's more questions that Jack is there waiting. The other thing that I find interesting is that reading Coleridge's journals and all his radical publications, he was the editor of a journal that was putting out very radical stuff, including anarchism, including radical redistribution of property, and so on and so forth. He never quotes Spinoza there. In that period of his life, Spinoza is exclusively a metaphysician. And what I'm going to say is that he didn't have any love for this political Spinoza, just like most of the German idealists didn't, right? If you read Schelling, it's rare to find a quote from the TTP or from the TP. And so in Coleridge, right? So it seems that in the mind of the
they were conservative. I mean, Marx took notes of Spinoza, so
exactly by that point, right? But Coleridge wasn't reading Marx.
Yes, of course.
But he was reading Schelling. He was reading Schlegel. He was reading Jacobi. So the fascination with more metaphysical, intellectual parts of Spinoza rather than seems
maybe Fior Michele opened his microphone because he wanted to ask something. Fior Michele? No. Okay, and so I switch his microphone. Okay, sorry, I because there was this echo. I didn't want to interrupt you, but maybe and sorry if I am so brute, I don't know, so, così brutale, but I may give the word to Jack. For the reason I said at the beginning of the meeting. And so Jack Stetter is assistant professor at Loyola University in New Orleans. He wrote his PhD thesis about le monisme spinoziste de la substance en contexte. And he wrote many things, but I want to remember a book he edited with Charles Ramon, because I really appreciated it, and the idea of putting two different traditions in dialogue: Spinoza in 21st century, American and French philosophy, metaphysics, philosophy of mind, moral and political philosophy. So we hear Jack's talk, who will speak about Spinoza in English 19th century, I think, or maybe not, maybe 20th century. Please, I shut up.
Okay, I'm having, first of all, a discovery of the joys of Microsoft Teams experience. It has got to be one of the most unwieldy applications I've ever had the joys of using. I for starters, I don't know, can you all see me okay? Because on my own image of myself, there's this terrible kind of lag. It says that my video is highlighted, but I don't know if that's a problem for you all. This
I think we can all see you and hear you. There is a little delay between the image and the voice, but it is not terrible. So
okay, it's very unfortunate. I don't know why it is. I've been getting logged out of Teams over and over, so I kind of, unfortunately, Emanuele, I missed part of your talk. I'm very sorry, but I thought what I did here was very interesting, and just responding to what you said at the very end there about the reception of Spinoza as a political thinker by the German idealists. You know, someone, you know, I think also, of course, from Johns Hopkins is really interested in this, Jason Yonever. And I think that would be interesting for you all to talk about that. But of course, Coleridge's Spinoza is, we've talked about this, you and I, and I thought this was a great talk you just gave. I thought it was very interesting, very original. Thank you. And Nastassja is no longer here, but also very well researched, very interesting. So I'm going to try to share a PowerPoint. Let's see how that goes. Okay. Bear with me, please. I almost am tempted to, here we go. Okay, if I just open it, there we go. Now I click on the open share tray. Okay. I have to open system preferences. What are you seeing right now, may I ask?
Spinoza and the philosophers of turn of the century Britain.
Okay, excellent. One moment while I further force this Microsoft Teams to let me use it. Okay, so I guess this is good. Excellent. I'm gonna try to make it full screen. Okay, this looks good to you all? Yeah?
Yes, it's better.
Okay, this is good? It's a full screen for you?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So I'll try to, actually this is one of those things that needs more work. There's a lot of material. Maybe there's something for everyone. I'll try to go through it at a somewhat brisk pace, but maybe there are things I'll slow down on and things I'll move more quickly over. I have the I have the unfortunate habit of making PowerPoints which are awfully wordy. That's why I generally don't like to make PowerPoints. But on the occasion I thought I would. So let me just skip the abstract. You might already have that. Okay, I don't want to do that. So the idea today would be looking at the reception of Spinoza. So this is, I guess, good that I come third in the late 19th century. in Britain. So to begin, we'll look at Frederick Pollock's Spinoza work, which was quite a watershed moment in Spinoza studies in English. Then we'll look at, very briefly, we'll look at that. And very briefly, we'll look at James Martineau's work from 1882. Also significant. And then thirdly, John Caird's Spinoza work from 1888, which is a work in British idealism. But again, only very briefly talking about that. Just some reference here. This is the year of publication of Appearance and Reality, 1893. And then what I'm most interested in is the work of Joachim. This is not what I want. There you go. His 3 works on Spinoza. Joachim was a student of Bradley. And I'm interested in looking at his treatment. So these 3 works here, right? From 1901, so yeah, 20th century as well. 1906, which is I think a very interesting work, The Nature of Truth. And 1940, his commentary on the Societas tenuto. So rather late work. So a bona fide British idealist. Talk about the relationship to Bradley, but he was a student. But I'm interested mostly, I mean, what I would like to get into at some point as I kind of continue to work on this more, tie it together more, is the treatment of how monism generates, how he thinks monism in Spinoza generates a theory of knowledge, which, while superior to the correspondence theory that he takes issue with, is beset with difficulties. So now the way it's actually going to turn out is I'm not going to probably say very much about it. I won't have enough to say about. I mean, I have a lot to say about it, but I won't have enough time to say about this, what I want to say. Haven't had enough time to prepare this adequately, but it's there. The material's there. You'll see it. So we'll probably only really talk a lot about this and some Bradley as well, and then the precursors, just to set the stage for where Spinoza's reception was at in the 19th century in the English-speaking world. Okay, this is Frederick Pollock. So here we go. A painting in the National Portrait Gallery. He was Sir Frederick Pollock. His work of 1880, Spinoza, His Life and Philosophy. Here you can see it, I assume. Is rather important for sort of rejuvenating Spinoza studies in English in its day and age. It's true that recent attention has been drawn to George Eliot's work. Of course, her translation of the Ethics wasn't published. Also, Coleridge, as we just saw, a very important conduit for a kind of, I think Emanuela would agree with this. You'll have to tell me if I'm mistaken, Emanuela. Kind of a German reception of Spinoza into Great Britain, but Pollock did a lot to kind of, again, actually in a sense, introduce some of the trends of German language work on Spinoza, specifically the more kind of familiar scientific scholarship of the 19th century. So this is the age of Van Vleuten and Land's edition of Spinoza, so important, of course. He's kind of a figure of many shades. So he's a scholar of jurisprudence and common law. He was best known for a commentary on English law, on correspondence with the Supreme Court Oliver Wendell Holmes. And he notes in 1880 that in English there is no complete or adequate translation of Spinoza. So he takes upon himself kind of to start to help develop a more, I guess you could say, scientific and maybe approach to Spinoza. So he, in 1883, 84, though, so around the same time, of course, this is kind of the trend. Eloise, who you may know still, publishes a collection, a trustworthy, in Pollock's word, abridgment of Spinoza's works. So, you know, Pollock is working on Spinoza, Pollock is diffusing Spinoza, Pollock is presenting Spinoza's life and philosophy to sort of a large reading audience, and Spinoza is getting translated. Van Vleuten and Land's edition of Spinoza appears a couple years later, making Spinoza scholarship more accessible in a sense, more feasible. You'll see that if you read the Pollock edition, there's a very large 40-page critical and biographical assessment of Spinoza. It's sort of setting out the meager state of Anglophone Spinoza scholarship prior to 1880. So just very briefly, I wanted to introduce him just so you could see that Spinoza scholarship was not in a great shape, you might think, at least as a sort of scholarly enterprise. I mean, of course, philosophers had an engagement with him, as we've seen, but there was sort of an attempt to give it a kind of scientific footing. And just because I'm interested in, as I said in the, oops, that's not right. As I said in the original title, I was interested in the reception of Spinoza's monism specifically, which I think is kind of the thing that interests most Pollock as a thinker and these other figures, and especially the British idealists. I just thought I would just quickly sort of give that to you here. Maybe it's not so significant we talk about it, but he does kind of take issue with sort of a Kantian, right, reading of Spinoza that was popular still at the time. You might recognize this, something also Geroux articulates. Thinks that Spinoza does not view substances inaccessible to human understanding, by being clouded over or hidden behind the attributes. He takes the attributes as constituting the essence of substances being very important for understanding Spinoza's metaphysics. And this is very interesting because the whole reading Pollock gives both kind of justifies a more, I guess you could say, rigorous material culture for dealing with Spinoza, while simultaneously arguing that, you know, Spinoza himself was a sort of scientist. And he would aim, he says, to downplay the distinction between intelligibility and existence. So a nice long quote here. Maybe not worth getting too deep into, but you see, I mean, in a certain sense, there's a kind of a very careful reading of Spinoza here, and not so much like a patchwork of intuitions, but you know, we're thinking of sort of an imminent critique now. So more recognizable, I would say, to contemporary approaches. And, okay, so Pollock is doing a lot for Spinoza scholarship. That was basically the point here. And to study Spinoza in the late 19th century, Frederick Pollock is just kind of an interesting figure in his own right, which should be looked at. But I'm not going to dwell on this. Okay, another figure I'll just go over very briefly because of, again, his significance at the time. James Martineau. These are all figures also I thought it'd be interesting just to talk about because they're mostly forgotten today. And this is part of just what I want to do is just sort of introduce some new figures, old forgotten figures. So Martineau wrote a book about Spinoza, The Study of Spinoza, A Study of Spinoza. And Martineau was a pretty interesting character as well. Trained as a preacher of Unitarianism, a professor of mental and moral philosophy and political economy at Manchester New College. He was kind of widely admired in his day and age for the role he played in shaping Unitarian thought. Worked mostly in the philosophy of religion, advocating to abolish the clergy of the Church of England, which is interesting, and put it directly under state control. Better known figures like Alfred Lord Tennyson had great respect for his status as an intellectual, as did William Gladstone. You may, of course, recognize the names. He wrote this popular commentary, very popular commentary on Spinoza, entitled just Spinoza, Study of Spinoza, wide reading, intended for a wide reading Anglophone public. It's part of a series edited by Agnes Knight called Philosophical Classics for English Readers. It eventually go too long for the series and published on its own. So part of a effort, you might think, to vulgarize Spinoza. Maybe that's too derogatory, but certainly to popularize and make more accessible to the intelligent layperson. It's not a great book, I'll be honest. In comparison to Pollock's work, it's inferior. It's neither terribly accurate nor terribly informative. What's interesting about it, though, is to see him. Again, I'm sort of focusing on the thoughts about Spinoza's metaphysics, which I think are kind of what dominate in the period. It's interesting to see him engage with other textbook views on Spinoza, mostly in German. Kuno Fischer, who, if I'm not mistaken, also may have played a very important role in shaping Nietzsche's reading of Spinoza. For example, he's in debate with Fischer. He's in debate with J.E. Erdmann. Again, the kind of Kantian readings. So you have a Spinoza in now who is being read through the lens of other national cultures and engaged with, I would say, in a very scholarly manner. That's interesting. This aspect talk I thought was kind of fascinating when I first read it. He talks about attributes, aspects of substance, because that's kind of something the term you'll still find in English language literature on Spinoza today. So there's something to be looked at there. He thinks it's a pretty flawed system in many ways. I think it's not worth dwelling too much on. I just want to skip ahead. There's another issue he takes problem with, and that is the nature and status of the multiplicity of finite modes, and vis-a-vis the oneness of substance. In this way, he's sort of now we're really on the doorstep of British idealism, and the way he kind of construes this is interesting, I thought. The crux of the matter he argues lies in Spinoza's transition from a discussion of self-causation to one of efficient causation, the sudden step into finiteness, which he thinks actually is made quite late in part one of the Ethics, I would say, but remains wholly unexplained, nay, is made under conditions which have been carefully proved to exclude it. So he's a very kind of interesting take on this problem of how we get from one substance to the multiplicity of finite modes, and whether it's possible. The term Spinoza sets it. He thinks it's not. Kind of have like I said, a foreshadowing of some problem the British idealists will see in Spinoza's work. So it's a mystery, as he claims, mysterious. So we could talk about that more, but I kind of want to move on to the later figures and who I think are more interesting. Starting with Caird, John Caird, who also, somewhat like Martino, authored a compact work. Here it is, Spinoza, for Blackwood's Philosophical Classics. Again, intended for a pretty wide readership. The cover page of the volume says it's a cheap edition, which is always kind of an interesting way to describe one's own work. His younger brother and fellow British idealist, Edward Caird, somewhat better known, authored works on Hegel and Kant as well. Some of the leading lights of their day in the British idealist movement, in fact. Caird, John, was a principal of the University of Glasgow. He'd published an important work on the introduction of philosophy of religion. And he was the first of the British idealists to write an entire monograph on Spinoza. So just giving him a kind of preeminence. He emphasizes Spinoza's, and in many ways it's, we'll see, well, he emphasizes Spinoza's doctrine's putative tendency to metamorphose into an abstract and empty substance monism. It's very Hegelian in inspiration. And this sort of Hegelian undercurrent, I mean, this is, there's a lot of actually interesting work being done on the British idealists and the role Hegel played in the British idealists. I think, well, I should have done more preparing, but I know in 1865, The Secret of Hegel came out. Now, who authored it? I can't recall. But anyway, the role that Hegel played in shaping the British idealist movement is somewhat interesting. I think it's worth looking at more carefully. But in this case, certainly Spinoza is sort of read through a Hegelian lens, and I think you will see that. This abstract and empty substance monism is the problem. So a central feature of Coleridge's interpretation of Spinoza consists in the emphasis he places on Spinoza's alleged pantheism, and supposedly Spinoza's conception of determination as negation for understanding the ultimate untenability of Spinoza's metaphysics. Coleridge's basic contention and refutation of Spinoza's metaphysics has to do both with the innate inadequacy of Spinoza's first principle, which would explain the universe, all the very fact that though Spinoza's principle of identification of the very essence of finite things is that they consist in negation or non-being, nevertheless, Spinoza, according to Coleridge, also creates the demand for a more complete and self-consistent philosophy, but ultimately and irreconcilably positing that finite things have self-affirmative natures. So it's a very kind of dialectical reading. And one of the ways you can see that is his discussion of finite and the infinite. So Spinoza's identification of the infinite with purely affirmative and the finite are determined with the negative. Following Hegel, Coleridge maintains that Spinoza calls on the principle of omnis determinatio est negatio, so well-known maybe misreading by Hegel. Coleridge suggests that this principle comes to Spinoza by virtue of his very adherence to the geometrical method, which is actually an interesting approach to the problem, wherein when we represent to ourselves the relation of infinite and finite by that of space and its determinations, the idea of the finite becomes that simply of privation or negation. Indeed, writes Coleridge, a figure in space has no individual reality. Insofar as there's any positive reality, it is only the reality that belongs to the part of infinite space which periphery cuts off. And insofar as it can be said to have any individual existence in distinction from infinite space, that existence is not positive, but negative. It is created solely by cutting off or negating all subspace outside it. So on Coleridge's view, Spinoza merely extrapolates from this conception of Euclidean space and applies this conception of spatial boundedness to all finite beings without distinction. Finite things, for Spinoza, have only a reality that expresses not what they are, but what they are not. Conversely, if at the very essence of the finite is non-esse, privation or negation of being, so the essence of the infinite is simply pure being, that which is, or that which cannot be conceived as existing, seeing its very nature as one with existence. Spinoza could have avoided this impasse, Coleridge thinks, since the alternative was purportedly logically available to Spinoza, to view substance as self-determination as not really an information that nulls, but assumes and includes negation. Right, this would have been right. So Spinoza, could have become Hegel, I guess is the idea. Coleridge writes that an affirmation which is reached by negation cannot ignore it, since apart from negation, pure affirmation has no meaning, and a negative element enters into its very essence. It seems like Coleridge, had been reading a lot Hegel's Science of Logic, something of that sort. Coleridge notes that, like the conception of pure space on which it is based, viewing infinite as pure information is a mere abstraction, for it needs the negative or determination as correlate. Thus, the infinite, in its highest sense of the word, must be conceived not as simple negation of the finite, but as that which once denies and affirms it. Right. So this sort of ambivalent dialectical reading. So to sum up, and to just to give you a sense of one of these, what the status of Spinoza was to the British idealists in the late 19th century, I think here's one example. The conception of an infinite that once denies and affirms the finite is essential to Coleridge's hyper-Hegelian, as I would call it, understanding of why Spinoza's philosophy is flawed, and it is flawed, of course, on his view. Summarized, although Spinoza did anticipate the fact that any affirmation involves negation and vice versa, nevertheless, Spinoza failed to apply this insight systematically and failed to see that to transcend the pure affirmation of substance by itself, which renders substance empty of content and unable to account for the concrete particular, right? This swallows up all finite determinations within itself, as Hegel says, that manifests itself in the world. Substance, or the primary principle of philosophy, needs to be a principle of self-negation as well. Well, okay. Hence, to paraphrase the Hegelian-minded British interpreter, we may say that insofar as the primary principle, or substance, cannot negate itself in the first instance, but can only do so as a result of some indwelling activity, the principle needs to be posited at its fullest as a result of the process of becoming itself. So, interesting for, I think, further unpacking how one might approach Spinoza as a Hegelian. Coleridge's contention with Spinoza, therefore, he fails to fully account for the dialectic that he has already and practically unwittingly put forth. He endeavors to build his philosophy around the idea of a purely purely infinite, infinity, excuse me, or a finite, which is merely the illusory substantiation of imaginary distinctions in the infinite. Nonetheless, the dialectically informed view is present in Spinoza's thought in bits and pieces, believes care. Spinoza is not an uncompromising pantheist. That's how he sums up the idea there. Right, so, okay, interesting figure. There could be a lot, we could say a lot about these views of infinite and substance, of course, but what I really want to do is talk about someone, so I've kind of gone rather quickly, but this gives me about, I think, 15 more minutes to discuss the person who interests me the most of this era, whose works on Spinoza I think are the most rich, and raised, I think, a really good question, actually, that I don't have an answer to. And I've been thinking about it a lot, and I still don't have an answer a lot. Well, I've been thinking about it, maybe not recently, but 2 years ago, I was thinking about it a lot. Harold Henry Joachim, 1868 to 1930. Yeah, so of course, the last work he published, it was published posthumously. A disciple, excuse me, of Bradley, who is, of course, right, considered by many the British idealist of sorts. His tutor at Oxford. Bradley publishes his best-known work, Appearance and Reality, in 1893, just for some sort of context here. And The Principles of Logic in 1883. It's actually The Principles of Logic of 1883, which is a really interesting work, by the way, in its own right. And I'm very intrigued by it. That here I'll sort of draw on to show how it informs his reading of Spinoza's metaphysics and what kind of theory of knowledge that allows for, and the problems in that. Okay, so just very quickly though, the early work on Spinoza, which is the best known today, and you still see it referenced in the literature. Samuel Newland's, his work that came out a couple of years ago, Reconceiving Spinoza. There are some references to Joachim's early work on Spinoza. A Study of Spinoza's Ethics. Here it is. It's published with Clarendon. I'm not sure they actually exist anymore. At Oxford in 1901. It remains cited in the literature on Spinoza, like I said, especially because of the Eleatic reading of Spinoza's monism, which he puts forward there. Here's a good quote to that effect. Spinoza's substance is not one as a unity of diverse and related elements, but as a unity which has overcome and taken into itself the distinctiveness of its diverse elements. And this absorption is so complete that in it there remain no elements, no distinctness, no articulation. So, for example, Hurley, in his work from 69, Spinoza's Metaphysics, thinks Joachim exhibits the tendency of a Spinoza reader to believe that insofar as all things are merely states of the one substance, there appears no way to treat things as bona fide, independent things and subjects of judgment, unless by abstraction. Hence, only God is a genuine subject of predication, which he thus says, sort of construes as a classic statement of the flower in the crannied wall motif. He notes that Joachim would deny real individuality for particular things, and this follows from the interpretation of the distinction between substance and mode as a more precise formulation of the distinction between things and properties. Other things only appear to be things, but this is an illusion. So you see Joachim still kind of playing a role in more recent scholarship, which makes him unlike the Kerr, Martino, Pollock trio, who I don't see cited very much. Let's focus on the problem that I'm really interested in with the time that remains. Spinoza's monism and its role in shaping a theory of truth. So he's working in the nature of truth. It extends the work of his tutor Bradley, especially his principles of logic. I said Joachim will actually articulate a coherent notion of truth. That's what he calls it. This is kind of controversial whether Bradley himself uses this term or would have embraced it. Some of the best readers of Bradley, I'm thinking, for example, Stuart Candlish's work, which is I just can't highly recommend enough. It's terrific. The Russell-Bradley dispute claims, this is a complete myth, and Bradley never held such a notion of truth. And actually, his reading is very nuanced and very interesting. But he denies that Bradley would have embraced that. So anyway, Joachim does. And as Russell will characterize it in 1910 and criticize it in 1910 as a monistic theory of truth. So tying together these sort of strands is what interests me. So let's look at some of the basics of Bradley's views on logic. I'm not a logician, and this isn't formal logic, so don't worry. some of the ideas there are very interesting, I think, and informative for understanding how Joachim's thinking about things. And then I'll show how Spinoza's monism comes up in connection with the theory of error. Specifically, that's what's interesting in the story here, and why I may take this as significant. Okay, so this is good. On track. Okay, another wordy slide with Bradley sort of looming in the background in a kind of pale orange yellow color. So just some context. Like his mentor, Bradley, Joachim held that the true conception of reality as the absolute, that is Bradley's view, of course, well known, well, somewhat well known in Appearance and Reality. There's a masterwork of philosophy of the era, in my view, forces us to take a strong stand on the nature of true judgments as involving a coherent and self-contained picture of reality as a whole. Any true judgment has to involve this, at some level, coherent and self-contained picture of reality as a whole. So Joachim says this is in the nature of truth. The truth itself is one and whole and complete, and all thinking and all experience move within its recognition and are subject to its manifest authority. So in his logic, Bradley, which is from 20 years before, Bradley aims to show that the genuine underlying subject of all judgments, as he calls propositions, is reality, which is a consequence of the fact that the fundamental logical structure of all judgments is hypothetical, which is a really crazy, fascinating idea, actually. The claim that universal judgments are hypothetical is intuitive, sort of enough. All animals are mortal. Means if anything is an animal, it is mortal. Okay, that's what Bradley says. The claim that singular judgments are hypothetical is much bolder. So just a quote from Bradley here. I'm not sure. You maybe decipher it better than I can. Bradley's very difficult. Our terms are all general, and state a truth which may apply as well to many other cases. I have a toothache. Both the eye and the toothache are mere generalities. The actual toothache is not any other toothache, and the actual I is myself as having this very toothache. But the truth, I assert, has been and will be true of all other toothaches of my altering self. Nay, I have a toothache is as true of another's toothache as of my own, and may be met by the assertion, not so, but I have one. It is in vain that we add to the original assertion this, here, and now, for they are all universals. They are symbols whose meaning extends to and covers innumerable instances. A very puzzling idea indeed. So this kind of has to do with the idea, just very briefly, because I think there's a lot to say about that. But this would have to do with this would follow from the fact that what Bradley calls the ideal content of a judgment is this, on his view, the ideal content of a judgment, which is limited to only part of the content of reality, to which the ideas terms of any judgment refer. So all judgment, he writes, then implies and depends on a selection made in reality, a selection which, passing into the judgment, conditions that essentially. So the statement, "This apple is red," must be understood as consisting of the proposition, reality is such that if there are any apples, some are red. Additionally, Bradley holds that judgments do not really consist of separable ideas. Ideas are not psychological items, but they are abstract universals, we saw that, and are only abstracted from complete judgments. So on Bradley's monistic view of truth, we want to call it that, I think we can, the only way a judgment could be other than hypothetical would be if its subject was a self-contained reality. And meanwhile, experience instructs us that plurality is false. There's this appeal to experience, which is kind of interesting. Since we always experience reality as a whole, he thinks. There's this interesting discussion of sort of the discussion of qualities of sugar, and that comes up again in Appearance and Reality. Science and that. Bradley sees as intimately related the rejection of the view of propositions built up of individual ideas, and the rejection of the view of reality is built up of individual inhabitants. Maybe that sums it up. Right, so I just gave you the Candlish quote, so you see that. It is one of the philosophy's myths that Bradley held a coherent theory of truth. Okay, well, and there's Russell's objection, which would be worth looking at. Well, let's see what Joachim does with that. He does kind of take that and run with it and try to develop a coherence theory of truth. And what he does first in the nature of truth to do that, and Spinoza will see, I think maybe you already kind of hear Spinoza there in the background, I'm sure you do, but it'll come up very explicitly. Actually, Bradley doesn't very often discuss Spinoza explicitly. So Joachim does. One of Joachim's aims in his nature of truth is to proffer a rebuttal of the theory of truth as correspondence. And this is, very interesting, I think. He takes it that several things are wrong with this theory, and his description of this is, I think, quite unusual. For starters, it suggests that truth is true for a given consciousness and seems thereby to saddle the representational device of cognition with an additional and unintelligible burden. Why would the one-to-one relation, a faithful description of true narrative, recognized by the mind between a fact and some idea it holds about it, ground veracity, which ostensibly remains true independent from any observation of it? That's the question he asks. The theory is thus spurious, since any good theory of truth need account for how the truth stands on its own. That's what Joachim believes. So for Joachim, the correspondence theorist overlooks the stubbornness, that's what he calls it, the stubbornness of truth. She tacitly gives ground to solipsism in maintaining that truth consists in the reproduction of a faithful description of some external fact for some conscious agent. So two desiderata emerge on the correspondence theorist's account, one of which is lost at the cost of the other. Either the independent truth will be and remain entirely in itself, unknown and unknowable, or if known or knowable, the truth will become a private personal possession dependent for its meaning upon an individual intuition, which itself is a particular psychical existence. And thus the theory will have defeated its own object, which was to vindicate the independence of truth. So, interesting criticisms. Actually, T.S. Eliot has one of his PhD actually on Bradley's philosophy, and it discusses this in that. Anyway, worth looking at. It's very interesting. Joachim is brought to conclude that the essential nature of truth does not lie in the correspondence of knowledge with reality. Truth is not adequately conceived as the ideal representation of fact, or as the image which faithfully reflects an original. And again, truth is not a quality, an immediate characteristic flavor of independent entities which are what they are in and for themselves without relation to mind. Okay, so what's better? Well, let's see. He thinks the coherence notion of truth is, and of course, we'll see about that. It has a problem. For starters, by considering truth as systematic coherence, the theory Joachim espouses accounts for the fact that conceiving does not mean to form a mental picture, but rather to think out clearly and logically, to hold many elements together in a connection necessitated by their several contents. Thus, the difficulty in conceiving of a centaur, he gives this example, is not that we cannot picture it, since certainly we can see it in children's fairy tales and the like, but rather because the elements constitutive of the centaur refuse to enter into reciprocal adjustment. They collide amongst themselves, or they clash with some of the constitutive elements in that wider sphere of experience, that larger significant whole in which the centaur must strive to replace. So he continues, the horseman might pass externally as a convenient shape for rapid movement, but how about this internal economy, his internal economy, structure, adjustment, function of inner organs? In case of the actual, the animal kingdom is his natural home, but if we persist in our attempt to locate the creature there, we should inevitably bring confusion and contradiction in that sphere of significant being, so far at least as it is manifest to us in our anatomical and physiological knowledge. Actually, this is rather disappointing because it appears that, in his argument, it appears that because our experiences do not instruct us as to the anatomical or physiological possibility of centaurs, they must conclude they cannot exist. They fail to cohere, right, this larger body of knowledge, but that larger body of knowledge is furnished by sense experience and experimentation, one might suppose, and not a priori reasoning or logical argument. So I'm not really sure how great an example he gives there, but it's important to him. Another thing he talks about regarding the utility of coherence theory of truth is brute facts. That's kind of come back up. Of course, we will recognize that if we've read recent Spinoza scholarship and discussions of the principle of sufficient reason and the work of Michael Della Rocca, for example. He has a whole thing about brute facts, Joachim, and he takes judgment isolation. He argues, he says, is to take it an abstraction from the conditions under which alone its meaning can be determined. So, what of brute facts that seem to impose themselves on everyday judgments of states of affairs, and to which we seem bound to acquiesce in conditions of epistemic humility? Well, it also comes in principle under the same heading as the judgment of science. Take, for instance, the brute fact that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Nice long quote here. The brute fact that Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC is pregnant with significance owing to the concrete political situation within which it took place. But the actual event was not a nucleus of brute fact. In case solid and distinct within a surrounding complex of conditions, it was Caesar, at the head of his army and animated by conflicting motives of patriotism and ambition, who crossed. This and more is the meaning of the historical judgment in its proper context, its definite meaning. This concrete happening is the fact affirmed in the judgment, if indeed you can arrest the expansion of its meaning even here. We can be sure, at any rate, the actual happening contains no bare crossing of a stream by a man in the abstract, as a solid grain of fact, separable from a complicated setting which particularizes it. Well, I shall be told, the brute fact still remains. Caesar did cross the Rubicon. You cannot get over that. But I am not maintaining the judgment of fact, even when taken at its lowest, is wholly false, even when it is as nearly isolated as it may be, even when its implied and appropriate context is as little developed as possible. I'm only denying thus that, as thus taken, it is wholly or absolutely true. And this is interesting. This I think, is essential to the project here. It's something that you might think is relevant to understanding Spinoza. That, to a certain degree, there are degrees of truth. Judgments are thus said possessed of truth insofar as they affirm a determinate meaning as moments or emphases of the significance affirmed in a systematic whole of knowledge. That's how he articulates that. So now here's the problem. Here's the problem for the theory. Do I have 5 more minutes, Francesco?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
5 or 10, but no more.
Excellent. 5 should be, let's see, plenty. 10 would be better. Okay, so negative element and error. It is this point that Joachim appeals to Spinoza's theory of ideas to extirpate a lingering difficulty, how the coherence theorists account for the negative element and error. So for a correspondence theory, this appears to be less of an issue at first. Of course, you can, for example, follow Descartes and maintain that error consists in the poor exercise of volitional judgment, not understanding per se. Right? We are said to err because we misuse our volition and acquiesce into obscure and confused ideas. But there is still the difficulty of explaining how false judgments really do representation work at all, and whether they have external or material counterparts, what material falsity consists in. Right? Joachim says this is some attempt to proffering a negative reality to which erroneous judgments correspond, or crude and desperate. So what are the coherence theorists then? Well, here's Spinoza. I think this is one of the most interesting kind of works, ways in which you see Spinoza kind of being called on here in the British idealist period. The monistic system allegedly helps formulate the reply, though further remodeling will be required. He takes Spinoza as handing over the view that incomplete or fragmentary thinking is not as such false. Each mind is a part only of the complete intelligence. Each thought is a fragmentary expression of the whole meaning of any judgment. Thus, the whole meaning, the one substantial significance, is partially expressed in each. And the partial expressions are different emphases which its self-affirmation demands. I had a little fun there with PowerPoint. Yet, note, Joachim's, although the intuition seems fine, this theory breaks down when we consider error or the fragmentary thinking which, claiming to be complete, is false. The supposed explanation of error is broken back, for either the many different minds constituted by a single thought of God have no distinctive being at all, and their plurality and the self-assurance of each or any of them are sheer inexplicable illusions for which Spinoza's theory can assign no real basis, or if the plurality is real, the thought distributed over them is itself many and not one. And on either alternative, the supposed explanation of error vanishes. So by laying the emphasis on the spurious certainty involved in erroneous judgment, here we have him reinstituting the inquiry into the Eleatic nature of Spinoza's monism. The fact that many minds are not really many allegedly secures their view of error as actually corrected within God, since God cannot hold erroneous beliefs. But this sacrifices the very issue that needed explanation, namely how erroneous judgment, which involves a certain pretension to self-assurance and isolation in Joachim's view, can be accounted for by a coherence theory of truth. Okay, and that's where things are kind of breaking down, you see. That's if we take error to its principle as the claim of the finite to self-dependence. We find that monism, at least in the form given to it by Spinoza, cannot render it intelligible. Joachim writes, "It is possible to insist upon the self-affirmation of the modes in their dependence and to attribute to them a self-contained individuality insofar as the one substance is expressed differently, uniquely emphasized each of them. But error involves that the modes contrive somehow to be apart from their coherence and to set themselves up in isolation from one another or against their substantial unity. And this declaration of independence, where that which declares that nothing real is declared, is unthinkable. this is basically the end. It is telling that Joachim's discussion of the nature of truth ends shortly thereafter. And this is actually recalling Coleridge. Description of Spinoza as a providential wreck. Joachim notes that the failure of Spinoza's form of monism to secure an adequate conception of false belief or erroneous judgment appears to force even the most fleshed out of coherent notions of truth to suffer a shipwreck at the very entrance of the harbor. It thus ends in disaster. That's how he describes his own project, just as it rescues us from the lull of safety induced by the correspondence theory. Again, it is fatally defective, and the substantial identity of thought, a fortiori forethought, and reality as a single whole is dogmatically not rendered intelligible. We are thereby now no nearer to an intelligible conception of the self-direction of the ideal experience and the continuous return from this otherness, which constitutes concrete unity. For Joachim, Spinoza's God fails to overcome the negative element. It simply is not in Spinoza's God. The inquiry thus ends on what might appear to be a defeatist note. The underlying philosophical problem remains unsolved. Within a strict coherence account of truth, what sort of constraints can put on false beliefs, and why are any beliefs even held fallible? Considered in Spinozistic language, granted substance monism, how can there be any false ideas in the first place? All ideas are in God. If there is a being God that renders them true or consistent with respect to a total explanatory context. Any instance of cogitation of mind is really an instance of cogitation of God. So whence the negative element? It's a good question, actually. So he returns to this. This is the last bit in his final work on the Societas de informazioni, and he again finds that, which I have here somewhere. He again finds that this is sort of Spinoza, Spinoza's monism, the theory of knowledge that allows for, which is so important to kind of salvage at this time when. Well, now we have Russell and Moore and so many adversaries to British idealism on the scene. Just really can't do it. It just doesn't work. So it's kind of another note of sort of abandonment. Sort of, I think that was something that Emanuele suggested, that Coleridge kind of turns his back on Spinoza at one point. And here it's looking similar. So, okay, Spinoza in late 19th century Britain, early 20th century Britain, Spinoza has severely criticized, and sort of great hope is held, but alas, the project here specifically, but elsewhere as well, fails. So that's an interesting survey. I hope you enjoyed it. I don't know why that slide's here. Now I will try to close my slideshow and rejoin you in the normal Microsoft Teams meeting. Let me see if I press this button. Don't hang up. Excellent. Okay. Thank you all very much for your listening to that.
Yes, thank you. And because I think many of us met Joachim's work on Spinoza, and Jack Stoll allowed us to grasp the wider philosophical presuppositions or targets, or how do you say in French, enjeux of these works, and so and more widely of English idealism. I think this also helps us in understanding against a naive idea of history of philosophy, how and how much the interpretation of a philosopher is, or at least maybe philosophically, or how do you say, surdeterminé, overdetermined, and so, or engaged, let's say. And I regret you at the end you couldn't say too much about. You spoke of Joachim as a philosopher, but anyway, those who know Spinoza and those who, and so everybody here, and those who knows Joachim very well understand the implication and the consequences. And so thank you. And if there are questions, I leave the word to the public, because we have 10 minutes more or less, because I have to escape. So And so if not, as always, as my duty is, I try to, what I would ask you is, how much do you think in Joachim philosophy how much is Joachim's philosophy indebted to Spinoza or to his reading of Spinoza, and how much, and that is maybe the same, maybe a totally different thing, do you think his philosophy make him reading Spinoza in a certain way? I mean, is he I don't know if, who comes first, Joachim as a philosopher or Joachim as a Spinoza reader, or as a, I don't know.
It's a very interesting question. I don't know if I have an answer. I guess that I think he has, oh gosh, that's actually a very interesting question. I want to say that it kind of depends on the work, of course. And I think what's interesting about this work I was just talking about, and then is the nature of truth, is that he has kind of a proper philosophical ambition, but one which he wants to give a Spinozist footing to. And he's doing this as kind of a rear guard action, sort of trying to protect the movement, the British idealist movement. Protect a certain maybe semantic holism, kind of sort of monism. So Spinoza is sort of a great ally in that, or it would appear to be, and yet something goes wrong. His other two works are on Spinoza, of course, are just Spinoza commentaries. But even there, like I hinted at, in both cases, you have the sense that his own philosophical preoccupations kind of lead him to reach pretty dramatic conclusions. So I mean, you know, he's a maybe a, like you might want to, a minor, but there's nothing indignant in that. A sort of minor philosopher, and yet with moments of I think very interesting insight into problems. But that's where I'm at. I mean, I think it is an interesting problem for Spinoza's theory of knowledge, what we do with ignorance and error and inadequate knowledge. Tough stuff, and it's, you know, I can hardly say that I have answers to that, but it's interesting to see Joachim in this kind of with this framework, this British idealist framework, and these sort of concerns about nascent analytic philosophy, as we now